The letter was already gone when Margaret Holloway woke up that morning. She did not need to read it to know what it said. She had heard enough the night before. The raised voice of her husband, Oliver, moving through the rooms like a cold wind. The sound of a trunk being dragged across the wooden floor. The low and final click of the front door. She lay still in bed for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that had replaced him. Then she rose, pulled on her shawl, and walked to the window. The Crescent Moon Inn stood at the edge of the village of Ashvale, just where the road bent sharply south toward the river. It had always been there, or so it seemed to the people who had grown up in that valley. Margaret's great-grandfather had built its first 2 walls by hand. Her grandfather had added the upper floor and the wide front porch. Her father, Arthur Holloway, had run the inn for 31 years, through floods and dry spells and 2 hard winters, and had kept it standing through all of it by sheer stubbornness and a deep, quiet love for the place. When Arthur died 6 months ago, he left the inn to Margaret, his only child. He also left her the debts, which she had not known about until the moneylender arrived at the door 3 days after the burial. Oliver had found out about the debts on the same day she did. She remembered watching his face change as the moneylender read through the list. The slow shift from surprise to calculation, and then to something colder and more final. He had said nothing in front of the moneylender. He had smiled, thanked the man, and closed the door. And then he had turned to Margaret and said, very quietly, that he had not agreed to marry a woman with a failing inn and a stack of unpaid bills, and that he expected her to find a solution before the situation became embarrassing. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of Margaret trying to run the inn, while Oliver sat in the front room and made suggestions that cost money they did not have. 6 months of travelers arriving and leaving, sometimes paying, sometimes not. 6 months of fixing one thing only to find 2 more things broken. And last night, after a long argument she had no energy left for, Oliver had packed his trunk and left. She looked at the inn from the window. The front gate needed a new hinge. One of the upper shutters hung crooked. The paint on the sign above the door had begun to peel, and the name of the inn was now only half visible. But the building itself was solid. Her great-grandfather had built the walls thick. Her grandfather had chosen good timber for the floors. The inn was tired, but it was not broken. Margaret dressed, went downstairs, and opened the front door. The morning air was cool and carried the smell of wet grass. She stepped out onto the porch and looked down the road in both directions. No sign of Oliver's carriage. He had truly gone. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel the weight of it. She was 28 years old. She had no children, no income beyond what little the inn earned, and now no husband. The moneylender had given her 30 days when he last came, and that had been 2 weeks ago. The inn had 7 rooms, a kitchen, and a small stable out back. It had one regular customer, an elderly man named George Fairfax, who rented the same corner room every Monday and left on Wednesday. Everything else was uncertain. She went back inside, tied her apron, and started a fire in the kitchen. She did not spend that morning crying. She spent it making a list. She found her father's old ledger in the drawer behind the front desk, opened it to a clean page, and wrote down everything she knew about the inn's finances. The numbers were not good, but she forced herself to look at them clearly. The moneylender was owed a specific amount. The coal supplier had not been paid in 2 months. The woman who came to help with laundry was owed 3 weeks of wages. There were smaller debts, a few shillings here, a small amount there, and they added up to a sum that felt enormous when she saw it written in one place. Then she wrote a second list. This one was for the things she could do. She could cook. She could manage the rooms herself if she had to. She could repair small things around the inn. She had learned from her father, who had believed that a person who could not fix a hinge or patch a wall was too helpless to be trusted with anything important. She could keep the fire going, and the rooms clean, and the food on the table. She was not helpless. She was simply alone, which was a different thing entirely. She made herself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and looked out the small window above the sink. The garden beyond it was overgrown, but the soil beneath the weeds was dark and rich. Her father had grown vegetables there for years. She could start it again. She could sell eggs from the 3 hens still living in the yard. She could offer a simple evening meal to travelers passing through. She could do things that cost nothing but her own effort, and that was exactly what she intended to do. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. She rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened it. The man on the step was not someone she recognized. He was perhaps 50, with a round face and tired eyes, and he was carrying a leather satchel under one arm. He introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Finch, assistant to the county moneylender. He had come, he said, to remind her of the outstanding debt and to inquire about her plans for repayment. Margaret looked at him steadily. She asked him to come in. She offered him tea, which he declined. She sat across from him at the front room table and told him plainly that her husband had left, that she was now managing the inn alone, and that she intended to begin repayments within the month. She did not know exactly how, but she knew she would find a way. Mr. Finch looked at her, the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided is unsolvable. He made a note in his book. He told her that his employer was not without sympathy, but that sympathy had its limits, and those limits were 30 days. He left her a copy of the total amount owed, folded inside an envelope, and walked back out to his horse. Margaret watched him go. She did not open the envelope right away. She already knew what was inside. The rest of that morning she spent cleaning. She moved through every room of the inn with a bucket and a cloth, dusting and scrubbing and straightening. She beat the dust from the rugs and hung them on the fence to air. She repaired the hinge on the front gate, using tools she found in her father's workshop at the back. She replaced a loose board on the porch steps that had been creaking for months. Each thing she fixed felt like a small answer to something large and frightening. By midday, the inn looked better than it had in months. The rooms were clean, the floors were swept, and the smell of wood polish had replaced the stale and heavy air that Oliver had somehow always carried with him. She stood in the front doorway and looked at the road, and for the first time that day, she felt something that was not fear. It was not quite hope either. It was something between the two, a quiet, stubborn determination that had no name but felt familiar, because she had seen it in her father's face many times before. She went back to the kitchen, took out a piece of bread and some cheese, and sat down to eat. That afternoon, 2 travelers arrived on horseback and asked for rooms. They were brothers, by the look of them, a man named Henry Caldwell and his younger brother, Ned. They were passing through on their way to the next town, and they needed a bed and a hot meal. Margaret gave them the 2 best rooms, lit the fires, and cooked a proper dinner. The brothers were polite. They paid before they went to bed, which was more than some guests managed, and they left early the next morning, with a kind word for the food. That evening, after they had gone up, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen with the payment in her hand. It was a small amount. It would not touch the debt that the moneylender was waiting on, but it was real money, earned by her own hands, in a single day. She put it in the small tin box behind the flour jar and washed the dishes. The week that followed was harder. 3 days passed without a single traveler. The coal was running low. She cut back the fires in the unused rooms and heated only the kitchen and the main sitting room. She lived mostly on bread and soup and the eggs from the hens. She fixed the crooked shutter by herself, standing on a ladder in the cold, with a screwdriver and 2 new screws she had found in her father's workshop. On the 4th day, she did something she had never done before. She walked into the village with a small sign she had written on a piece of card, and she pinned it to the notice board outside the village shop. It said, "Clean rooms, hot meals, fair prices. Crescent Moon Inn, half a mile east." She had no idea whether anyone would come, but she had learned, in these past days, that doing something was always better than waiting. A woman named Clara Hatch saw the sign and came that same afternoon. She was a dressmaker, visiting from the next village, and she needed a room for 2 nights. She paid in advance and brought her own tea. She was quiet and neat and no trouble at all. Before she left, she told Margaret that the rooms were lovely, and the soup was the best she had eaten in months. Margaret thanked her and went back to the kitchen, feeling something she had not expected to feel so soon. It was not pride exactly. It was closer to the feeling of a person who has been standing in the cold for a long time and has just found a fire. She put Clara's payment in the tin box, added it to what was already there, and looked at the number. It was still not enough, not even close to enough, but it was growing. 3 days later, she found something in her father's study that she had not noticed before. She had been going through the old shelves looking for a spare ink pot when she pulled out a ledger from the back of the bottom shelf, one she did not remember seeing among her father's regular books. It was older than the others, its cover worn soft, and its spine cracked along one edge. Inside, the handwriting was her father's, but the dates went back much further than she expected. Some entries were 30 years old. Others were from her father's early years at the inn, before she was born. Most of the entries were ordinary: supplies ordered, guests recorded, small repairs noted. But near the back of the book, the entries changed. There were payments received from unnamed parties, listed only by initials. There were references to a room she did not recognize, noted only as the East Room below, which made no sense, because the inn had no East Room below anything. There were careful, quiet notes about a particular section of the cellar floor that her father had described as uneven, though she had never found it uneven herself. And near the very last pages of the ledger, folded so tightly it had flattened into a single thick strip, was a hand-drawn map. It was drawn in her father's hand on a piece of old paper that had gone brown at the edges. The lines were careful and precise. She spread it out on the desk and looked at it for a long time. It showed the inn from above, the rooms, the kitchen, the hallways. But below the cellar level, there was another space drawn in, a long rectangular outline that did not match any part of the building she knew. Her father had labeled it in small, careful letters. He had written 2 words above it, and then, below the drawing, a single sentence in an even smaller hand. She read the sentence 3 times. Then she folded the map carefully along the same old lines, put it back in the ledger, and placed the ledger on the desk in front of her. For a moment, the room was completely quiet. She did not know what the map meant. She did not know if it was real, or if her father, in his last years, had been imagining things. She knew that he had sometimes seemed distracted in ways she could not explain. She knew that he had occasionally gone down to the cellar at unusual hours, and come back up looking as though he had been thinking hard about something. She had always assumed it was the worry of a man trying to keep a struggling inn alive. Now she was less certain. She put the ledger in the drawer, locked it, and went to start dinner. She told herself she would think about it later, when things were less urgent. There was a debt to pay, and an inn to run, and those 2 things had to come first. The map could wait. But that night, lying in bed in the silence that had once held her husband's breathing, and now held nothing at all, she found herself thinking not about the debt, or the cold rooms, or the empty stable. She found herself thinking about the 2 words her father had written above the drawing. He had called it the Old Vault. And she found, to her surprise, that she could not stop thinking about what might be inside it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees along the road, and the Crescent Moon Inn settled into the night, its thick old walls holding in the warmth, its floors quiet, its cellar dark and undisturbed. Whatever was beneath it had waited for a very long time. It could wait a little longer. But not, Margaret thought, forever. She closed her eyes and listened to the inn breathe around her, the way she had listened to it all her life. And for the first time since her husband had walked out, and her father had died, and the moneylender had come to the door, she felt something stir in her chest that she recognized. It was the particular feeling of a person who has just realized that they are standing at the edge of something much larger than they expected. She did not know yet whether that something was a blessing or a danger. She would find out soon enough. The days that followed did not slow down to give Margaret time to catch her breath. A cold snap moved into the valley during the 2nd week, turning the mud on the road to frozen ruts and driving travelers indoors earlier than usual. This was, in an unexpected way, good for the inn. 3 guests arrived in 2 days, all of them looking for warmth and a hot meal before dark. Margaret kept the kitchen fire burning from before sunrise until well after dark. She cooked plain food, but she cooked it well. Thick soups, roasted root vegetables, bread that came out of the oven firm and brown, and smelling of something that made people sit down and stop talking for a moment. She had learned to cook from her mother, who had died when Margaret was 12, and from her father, who had believed that feeding people was one of the few things a person could do that was always right, no matter what else was going wrong. Margaret had absorbed both their lessons without quite realizing it. Now, standing at the stove in the quiet early mornings, she found that cooking was one of the things that steadied her. It required attention, and attention kept her from thinking too far ahead into the parts of the future she could not yet see. The 3 guests that week paid on time and left no damage behind them. One of them, a quiet older man named Frederick Barton who was traveling to visit his daughter in the south, left a small coin on the windowsill of his room before he checked out. It was more than the bill required. When Margaret pointed this out, he waved his hand and said the bed had been the warmest he had slept in since the previous spring, and that he intended to come back through in the autumn and hoped the inn would still be there. Margaret told him it would be. She did not know if that was true, but she said it with enough certainty that it sounded like a fact, and Frederick Barton nodded as though it was, and walked out to his horse and rode away down the frozen road. The money in the tin box behind the flour jar was growing. Not fast enough, not nearly fast enough, but it was growing. She calculated the gap between what she had and what she owed. It was still large, but for the first time, it felt like a gap and not a wall. She found, in those early weeks, that the inn had a rhythm of its own once you paid attention to it. Travelers came more often on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because those were the days the market ran in the next town, and people were on the roads between early morning and late afternoon. She started preparing extra food on those days, and keeping the fire in the front sitting room going from midday. She hung a lantern outside the door after dark so that the inn was visible from the road when the light was failing. Small things, practical things. Each one made a difference she could measure. Her neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Cole, came by one afternoon with a basket of onions from her garden and stayed for tea. Dorothy was 63, wide in the shoulders, with a directness that Margaret had always appreciated. She sat at the kitchen table, looked around the room carefully, and told Margaret that the place looked better than it had in 2 years. Margaret thanked her. Dorothy set her cup down and looked at her steadily. She asked about Oliver. Margaret told her plainly that he was gone and that she was managing alone. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which was not something she often did. When Margaret finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, simply, that a man who left a woman at the hard part was not worth the worry of a single afternoon, let alone any longer than that. She said it without drama, the way a person states something that is so obviously true it barely needs to be said. Then she poured herself more tea and asked whether Margaret needed help with the laundry. Margaret accepted the offer. They set up a working arrangement that suited them both. Dorothy would come on Fridays to help with the washing and mending, and Margaret would give her a share of whatever the kitchen produced that day. It was a practical exchange between two practical women, and it helped. What helped even more was something Margaret had not expected to feel useful: her father's workshop. Arthur Holloway had been a man who believed in keeping things working. He had never called a tradesman for anything he could fix himself, and his workshop at the back of the inn reflected this. It was a long, narrow room, with tools, organized on the walls, with a care that made Margaret realize, looking at them now, how much thought her father had put into order. There were hammers, and saws, and planes, and chisels, all hung in rows. There were jars of nails, sorted by size. There were lengths of timber in the corner, dried and seasoned, waiting for some future use. Margaret began spending an hour there each morning before the guests woke, learning what each tool did and practicing on pieces of scrap wood. Within a week, she had repaired 2 chairs in the dining room that had been wobbling for months, replaced 3 rotten boards in the stable floor, and fixed the latch on the gate at the top of the garden path. Each repair was small, but each one removed something from the list of things that needed doing, and the list was what frightened her most. As long as she was shortening it, she felt in control. She also, in those quiet morning hours, returned to her father's old ledger. She opened it carefully each time and read through the entries she had not yet fully understood. The references to unnamed payments were scattered through a period of about 4 years, beginning when Margaret was 5 years old and ending abruptly when she was 9. She did not remember anything unusual from those years. The inn had always seemed the same to her, busy in summer, quieter in winter, always warm, always smelling of whatever her father was cooking. But reading his notes now, she could sense a tension running beneath the ordinary entries. He wrote in his usual careful hand, but sometimes a line would appear that was clearly meant for no one but himself, a question, or an observation, or something that read like the beginning of a thought he had not finished. The most unusual entry was near the end of the section she was studying. It was a single line, written with a heavier pen than the rest, as though her father had pressed down harder than usual. "It is not mine to open, but it is mine to keep." She read that line many times over the following days. She could not tell what it referred to, but she felt its weight. Her father had been a careful man. He had not been prone to drama or mystery. When he wrote something down, he meant it literally. Whatever was beneath the inn, Whatever that map had been pointing to, he had known about it and had made a deliberate decision not to disturb it. She asked herself whether she should make the same decision. She had not gone back down to the cellar since finding the map. The cellar was dark and cold, and she avoided it unless she needed to fetch coal or the jars of preserves she had put up in the autumn. But now, with the map in the back of her mind, it felt different. It felt like a room with a question in it. One evening, after the last guest had gone to bed and the inn was quiet, she took the lamp from the kitchen table and went to the cellar door. The stairs were steep and narrow. She had gone down them hundreds of times in her life, always for practical things: coal, jars, the spare set of bed linens she kept in the old chest at the bottom. The cellar was not particularly large. It ran beneath the kitchen and the front sitting room, stopping short of the east wall of the building. The floor was stone, old and dark, and always slightly damp, no matter what the season was outside. She walked through the cellar slowly, holding the lamp low. She was looking for what her father had described as the uneven part of the floor near the east wall. She had thought she knew every inch of this floor. She had played down here as a child while her father worked, and she had spent enough hours here in her adult life to think of it as familiar. But as she moved toward the east wall, she noticed something she had not paid attention to before. The floor near the wall was lower than the rest. Not dramatically, just a few inches, but enough that the wall above it met the ceiling at a slightly different angle. She crouched and pressed her hand flat against the stone. It was cold, as always, but it was also, she realized, a different kind of cold from the rest of the floor. Drier. Older, as though something beneath it was sealed away from the moisture of the ground. She stood up and looked at the wall. There was nothing unusual about it. The same old stone as the rest of the cellar, slightly discolored near the base where years of coal dust had settled. But when she placed her palm flat against it and pressed, just slightly, just to see, the stone did not feel entirely solid. There was a faint give to it, not movement exactly, but a slight change in resistance, the way a door feels different from a wall, even when they look the same. She stepped back and held the lamp up so the light fell across the whole east wall from a slight angle. In that raking light, she could see what she had never noticed in direct light. The mortar between two of the large stones was a slightly different color from the mortar around them. Lighter, newer, or perhaps not newer, but different, mixed from a different batch, a different decade. Someone had built something here, or sealed something here, and then repaired the surface carefully enough to hide it from a casual look. She was standing there, hand pressed against the cold stone, lamp raised and mind moving very fast, when she heard a sound from above her. It was the front door. A guest arriving late, she thought, or the wind. She had left a window cracked in the sitting room. She took her hand off the wall, turned, and went back up the stairs. She closed the cellar door behind her and went to the front hall. A man was standing in the doorway. He was tall and very still, wearing a long traveling coat dark with rain. He had not knocked, which meant the door had not been properly latched. She added that to the list of things to fix. He looked at her with an expression that was neither apologetic nor particularly friendly. It was the look of a person who is accustomed to arriving places and being accommodated, without too much conversation. She asked if she could help him. He said he needed a room. His name, he said, was Mr. Edmund Voss. He was passing through and had been caught by the weather. He required a room and a fire, nothing more. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the way he stood, the particular straightness of his posture, the way his hands were still at his sides, that suggested this was a man who was used to having things arranged around him, rather than arranging himself around things. She noted this without judgment. Plenty of people who came through inns were exactly like this. What mattered to her was whether he was going to pay, and whether he was going to cause trouble. She told him the rate. He agreed without discussion. She showed him to the room at the end of the upper hall, the one that had the largest fireplace and the best-fitting window. She lit the fire herself, brought him extra blankets without being asked, and told him that if he wanted food, she could have something ready in 20 minutes. He said he would take whatever was available. She went downstairs and made a plate of bread and cold beef and a dish of pickled vegetables, which was what she had left from dinner. She brought it up on a tray. He had removed his coat and was sitting in the chair by the fire, reading something. He put it down when she came in, looked at the tray, and said thank you, in a tone that suggested the words were not something he used very often. She told him she hoped it would do, and went back downstairs. She washed the last of the dinner dishes, banked the kitchen fire, and checked the locks on the doors. Then she went back to the cellar door and stood in front of it for a moment, thinking about the wall and the different colored mortar and the slight change in the feel of the stone. She had too many things to think about. She needed sleep. She went to bed. The guest in the room at the end of the hall stayed quiet all night. In the morning, when she came down to start the kitchen fire, she could hear him moving around upstairs, not restlessly, but with a kind of deliberate quiet that made her think he was not a man who woke slowly or spent time lying in bed. He was someone who rose and moved directly into the day. She had the fire going and bread on the table when he came downstairs. He sat at the table without ceremony and ate without complaining. He asked for more tea, which she provided. He did not make small talk. He did not ask about the inn, or about her, or about the village. He read his papers, and drank his tea, and ate his bread. And when he was done, he folded his papers precisely, and set them aside, and looked at the room, with the kind of attention that she recognized, because she had been using it herself for weeks. It was the look of a person who is measuring something. She asked, because she was curious, and could not help it, whether everything was satisfactory. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were gray and very steady. He said that the room had been extremely comfortable, and the fire had been exactly right, and that the bread was better than he had expected. She thanked him. She asked if he would be staying another night. He paused before answering. Then he said he believed he would. He had some things to attend to, and the weather was not improving. She marked his name in the register, E. Voss, room 4, and went back to the kitchen. She told herself that he was simply a guest, a quiet one, which she appreciated, a paying one, which she needed, nothing more. But that evening, coming in from the garden, she passed the window of the sitting room and saw him through the glass. He was standing in the middle of the room, which was strange, because there was nothing in the middle of the room worth standing in front of. He was looking at the floor, not at anything on the floor, at the floor itself. He had his head slightly tilted, and one hand was resting against the door frame, and he was completely still. She watched him for a moment, not quite sure why she did not simply come inside. He looked like a man listening for something, or measuring something, or both. Then he looked up and saw her through the glass, and his expression did not change, but something in it shifted in a way she could not read. She came inside and asked if he needed something. He said no. He said he had simply been admiring the floor. The stone, he said, was very old. You did not often see flagstone this well laid in a building of this type. She agreed that the floors were old, and that her father had always kept them in good repair. He nodded once, slowly, and went back upstairs. She stood in the sitting room alone, looking at the floor. Then she looked at the east wall. Then she thought about the cellar, and what was below it. And she thought about a man who had arrived unexpectedly in the rain, who had said his name was Edmund Voss, and who stood in the middle of a room, staring at the floor, as though it had said something to him. She was not sure what any of it meant, but she was very sure that it meant something. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat down to wait for morning. Edmund Voss did not leave the next morning. He did not leave the morning after that either. Margaret watched him from a careful distance, the way she watched everything these days, with attention, but without showing it too plainly. He rose early, ate his breakfast in near silence, and then spent his days in ways she could not quite account for. He walked the property, not obviously, not in a way that would have made her ask him to stop. He was a guest, after all, and guests were free to walk, but thoroughly. She caught him standing at the side of the building in the late morning, looking up at the roofline. She found him in the garden in the afternoon, not walking among the beds but standing at the edge of the plot near the east wall of the inn, looking at where the ground met the building's foundation. He was never doing anything that required an explanation. He was always just looking. On the third evening, she brought his dinner to the small table near the sitting room fire, as had become their habit. He thanked her in his clipped, direct way, and asked whether the inn had been in her family for many generations. She told him it had been. 4 generations of Holloways. Her great-grandfather had built the first walls. He asked when that had been. She told him the rough date, as best she knew it. Her father had spoken of it often enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, in the same level tone he used for everything, whether she had ever researched the land beneath the inn. whether she knew what had been here before the building was erected. It was a strange enough question that she paused before answering. She said she had not. The inn was the inn. It had always been there. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected, and turned back to his dinner. She did not sleep well that night. In the morning, she went to the cellar before Edmund came down for breakfast. She took the lamp and the old ledger, and she went back to the east wall. She opened the ledger to the map her father had drawn, and held it up in the lamplight, comparing the drawing to the space in front of her. The dimensions were right. The wall she was looking at was precisely where the map showed the edge of the space below, and the section of floor she had noticed before, lower, drier, colder in a different way, was exactly where the map showed something her father had labeled only as the entrance. She looked at the map for a long time. Then she looked at the wall. She thought about what her father had written. "It is not mine to open, but it is mine to keep." He had kept it. For 30 years, by the look of the ledger, he had known it was there, and had said nothing, and done nothing, and simply kept the inn running above it, year after year after year. She wondered what had made him decide to keep it, rather than open it. She wondered if he had been afraid. She wondered if he had known whose it was. She went back upstairs, put the ledger away in the drawer, and locked it. Edmund was at the breakfast table when she came into the kitchen. He had made himself tea, which she would normally have minded. The kitchen was her space and guests were expected to wait in the sitting room, but she found she did not mind it from him, because he had also made her a cup and left it at the opposite side of the table, which meant he had expected her to come in and had thought to prepare for it. She sat down, she wrapped her hands around the cup. She looked at him and decided that she was not going to wait any longer. She asked him directly what he was looking for. He did not look surprised by the question. He set his own cup down and looked at her with the steady gray eyes that never seemed to hurry. Then he said, just as directly, that he was looking for something that belonged to his family, something that had been lost for a very long time. He had reason to believe it might be connected to this property, and he had come to see whether that belief had any substance. She asked him what it was. He was quiet for a moment, the way a careful person is quiet when they are deciding how much to say. Then he asked her, instead of answering, whether she had ever heard the name Aldenmuir. She thought. The name was not completely unfamiliar. She had heard it once or twice as a child, she thought, her father mentioning it in passing, though she could not remember in what connection. She told Edmund this. He nodded. He told her that his full name was Edmund Voss, and that he was the Duke of Aldenmuir. She looked at him. He looked back at her. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said that he was welcome to stay as long as he needed, and that the room rate remained the same regardless of title. He looked at her in a way that was perhaps the closest he came to smiling. Not quite a smile, but a slight change around the eyes, and he said he would expect nothing less. She drank her tea. He drank his. The kitchen was quiet, except for the fire. Then she stood up, went to the drawer, unlocked it, and took out the ledger. She carried it to the table and set it in front of him. She opened it to the map. She watched his face. He was still for a very long time. He leaned forward and looked at the drawing carefully, the way a person looks at something they have been searching for and are not quite sure they are really seeing. He looked at her father's handwriting, the careful labels, the precise lines. He looked at the two words above the outline and the single sentence below. His expression did not change in any obvious way, but his hands, resting on the edge of the table, pressed down slightly harder against the wood. He said, very quietly, that her father had known. She said she believed so, yes. He asked how long she had known about the map. She told him. A few weeks, since she had started going through her father's papers after he died. He straightened and looked at her. He asked why she had not done anything about it. She told him she had been too busy trying to keep the inn from being sold out from under her, to spend time thinking about what might be underneath it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he asked about the debt, not in a nosy way, but in the way a person asks when they have been making calculations and need one more number to finish. She told him the amount. She did not feel ashamed to say it. It was a fact, like any other fact. He sat back in his chair and looked at the map again, and she could see him thinking, not the slow thinking of someone who is confused, but the fast, quiet thinking of someone who is very good at moving pieces into position. He said that he would like to propose an arrangement. She said she was listening. He told her that if what was beneath the inn was what he believed it to be, It would have significant value. Not only financial value, but legal value. The kind that could settle a dispute his family had been dealing with for decades. He would bring the right people in to investigate and excavate with proper care. In return, he would cover the outstanding debt, and she would receive a fair and agreed portion of whatever was recovered. She looked at him across the table. She thought about her father's line, "It is not mine to open, but it is mine to keep." She thought that her father had kept it for a reason. She thought about what that reason might have been, and whether it was still a good enough reason, and what her father would have said if he had known that the inn was about to be taken away because she could not pay its debts. She thought her father would have told her to be practical. She told Edmund she was willing to listen to the terms, but she told him also that nothing would be agreed on a handshake. She wanted the terms in writing, signed and witnessed by someone official. She wanted the percentage written down clearly. She wanted it done before a single stone was moved. He looked at her with that almost not a smile again. He said that those were entirely reasonable conditions, and that he would have thought less of her if she had not insisted on them. She told him she did not particularly mind what he thought of her, but she was glad they were in agreement. They spent the rest of that morning working out the terms. He was precise, and she was careful, and they went over every point twice. By the time Dorothy Cole arrived for her Friday work and found them sitting at the kitchen table with papers between them, they had reached an understanding that satisfied them both. Dorothy looked at the papers, then at Edmund, then at Margaret. She said nothing, but raised her eyebrows in a way that contained an entire conversation. Margaret told her there was laundry to be done, and tea would be ready in an hour, and Dorothy took off her coat and went to work without another word. That afternoon, Margaret walked to the village with Edmund and stood beside him at the magistrate's office, while the arrangement was written up in legal language and signed by both of them in front of a witness. She kept her copy folded in her apron pocket when they walked back. She could feel the paper against her side the whole way home. That evening, after Edmund had gone up to his room, and Dorothy had gone home, and the inn was quiet, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, with a lamp and the signed agreement, and read it through one more time. Every line, every clause. It said what she had agreed to. No more, no less. She put it in the tin box behind the flour jar, next to the money she had saved. Then she took the old ledger from the drawer and opened it to the map one last time. She looked at her father's careful lines and his careful words. She thought about the 4 generations of Holloways who had stood in this building and kept it alive, one season at a time, through everything the world had sent their way. She thought her father would understand. She closed the ledger and went to bed. And somewhere beneath the floor, in the sealed quiet of a space that had been undisturbed for more than 100 years, something waited. The notice that went out from the magistrate's office was brief and formal, as such notices always are. It said only that a property survey was to be conducted at the Crescent Moon Inn, authorized by the landowner and a named party, in accordance with county law. It gave no details about what was expected to be found, because neither Margaret nor Edmund wanted details circulating before they had any certainty to back them up. But in a village like Ashvale, a formal notice pinned to the magistrate's board was more than enough. By the following morning, the talk had started. Margaret heard it first at the village shop, where she had gone to buy flour and salt and a length of good rope. The shopkeeper, a broad man named Gilbert Reed, handed her the change with a look that had too much in it to be casual, and said he had heard she was having the ground looked at. She confirmed it, gave him nothing more, and left. On the walk back, she passed 2 women she knew by sight, who stopped their conversation the moment they saw her, and looked at her with expressions that were equal parts curiosity and something less generous. She walked past them without stopping. She had learned, in the past weeks, that the opinions of people who had not helped her were not a thing she needed to spend energy on. The moneylender had not helped her. Oliver's friends had not helped her. The village had watched her struggle from a distance and had mostly kept to itself. Now that something appeared to be happening, their interest had returned, but interest was not the same as support, and she had stopped confusing the two. At the inn, Edmund was in the sitting room, with a map spread on the table. Not her father's hand-drawn map, but a large, official one, with county markings and elevation lines. He had sent for it the day before, and it had arrived early that morning by messenger. He was marking points on it with a small pen, and he looked up when she came in with her shopping. She set the flour on the table and looked at the county map. It was detailed enough to show the exact footprint of the inn, the garden, the stable, The road. She could see, in the old boundary markings at the eastern edge of the property, lines that stopped and started in ways that did not quite make sense to her. She asked what she was looking at. Edmund explained. He told her that the land beneath the inn had been disputed territory in the 1740s, during a period of civil unrest that had affected land ownership across several counties. The Aldenmuir estate had held various assets across the region, and during that period of instability, a significant portion of those assets had been secured below ground to protect them from the disruptions of the time. This was not unusual. Many families had done similar things during unstable decades. What was unusual was that the location had been sealed so thoroughly, and the records of it lost so completely, that the Aldenmuir family had spent 60 years unable to prove what they owned, and what had simply been transferred to other parties without their consent. He showed her the county boundary line. The Crescent Moon Inn, he explained, sat directly on the edge of what had once been Aldenmuir territory. The inn itself was on the western side of the line, which meant it had never technically been Aldenmuir land, but the space beneath it, the sealed vault her father had mapped, extended eastward past the boundary line, which meant that whatever was inside it might legally belong, at least in part, to the Aldenmuir estate. She looked at the map. She looked at where the boundary ran. She thought about her father's careful note, "It is not mine to open," she said quietly, that her father had known. Edmund looked at her. He said he believed so. He believed her father had understood that the space beneath his inn crossed a boundary he did not feel he had the right to disturb, and so he had simply kept it, kept the building above it in good repair, kept the knowledge to himself, and waited. She asked what he had been waiting for. Edmund said he did not know. Perhaps he had been waiting for the right person to come along and make the decision he could not make himself. Margaret did not say anything to that. She looked at the map for a moment longer, then went to put away the shopping. The excavation team arrived 2 days later. Edmund had arranged for 3 men he trusted, a specialist in structural survey whose name was Howard Lennox, and 2 careful workers who had done similar work on old buildings before. They arrived with equipment that Margaret could not entirely name, and they moved through the inn with a methodical quietness that she appreciated. They did not stomp or shout. They measured carefully, spoke in low voices, and asked her permission before touching anything. Howard Lennox, the survey specialist, spent 3 hours in the cellar on the first day before he said anything to either of them. When he came up, he had a small notebook full of measurements and an expression that he was working to keep neutral. He told Edmund that the space was real. The void beneath the east cellar floor was measurable. It was not small. Based on what he could determine from the acoustic tests he had run against the stone, tapping the walls and listening to the returns, the sealed area was approximately 12 feet wide by 20 feet long. Its ceiling was intact. Its contents were unknown. Its entry point, he believed, was through a section of the east wall that had been very carefully bricked up, using materials that were deliberately matched to the original stonework, but were distinguishable, to a trained eye, by their slightly different composition. Edmund asked how long it would take to access it safely. Howard said, depending on what they found as they worked, between 8 and 14 days. Margaret asked whether opening the wall risked destabilizing the building above it. Howard looked at her with the appreciation of someone who has just been asked exactly the right question. He said that was precisely what he had been calculating, and that in his assessment, the vault had been built with the building above in mind. Whoever had sealed it had done so in a way that actually added structural support to the east cellar wall rather than weakening it. Opening it from the inside, with care, would not threaten the inn. Margaret felt something relax in her chest that she had not realized was tight. She told him to proceed. That evening, after the survey team had packed their instruments and gone back to the rooms she had arranged for them at the inn, she sat at the kitchen table with Edmund across from her and a pot of tea between them. He poured. She had noticed that he consistently poured for both of them without making it a point of anything, which she appreciated more than she would have said out loud. She asked him, because the question had been sitting in her mind for days, what was in the vault? What did he actually believe they would find? He told her what his grandfather's records had described: gold coin, which might or might not still be in good condition after a century of sealed storage. Jewelry, belonging to the Aldenmuir family, and significant both in value and in historical record. Certain documents, specifically land charters, that had been declared lost, and whose recovery would resolve a claim that had been contested in the county courts for 6 decades. The land dispute, he explained, had cost the Aldenmere estate enormous sums in legal fees, and had prevented them from developing or selling or building on a significant portion of land that was technically theirs, but practically inaccessible, without the original documentation. She asked what the land was worth. He named a figure. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she understood now why he had come himself, rather than sending an agent. He said that when something matters enough, you come yourself. She thought about that. She thought about her father, who had also come himself, every day, for 31 years, to a building that barely paid its way. She thought about what it meant to consider something worth your own time and presence, rather than someone else's. She asked Edmund whether he had any family. He said he had a sister and a nephew, both of whom lived on the estate. He said it without particular warmth or coldness, the way he said most things, as a fact. She asked whether his sister knew he was here. He said she knew he was investigating a lead. He had not told her the details, because he did not yet know whether the details were real. She nodded. She understood not telling people things until the things were certain. She had spent the last several weeks doing exactly that, keeping her own counsel, making her own decisions, not asking for input on matters that were hers to decide. They drank their tea. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and was working at the old inn, the way wind always worked at old buildings, finding the small gaps, pressing at the places where the wood was thinner, looking for a way in. The inn held against it, as it always had. Margaret looked at the lamp on the table, which was the only light in the room. It made everything look amber and quiet. She thought about the vault below them, sealed and dark and waiting. She asked Edmund, because she was curious, and because she had decided that life was too short and too complicated to leave good questions unasked, why he had not had someone else handle this from the beginning. He was a duke, she said. He had people who worked for him. Why had he come himself and checked into an ordinary inn, under his ordinary name, and spent days walking the property like a man with nothing better to do? He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment, not the calculating quiet he sometimes used, but a different kind, the kind that means a person is deciding to be honest. He said that there had been other leads, over the years, people who had brought his family documents and claims about the vault's location, some in good faith and some not. Each time, someone else had followed up. Each time, the lead had come to nothing. He had decided that if he was going to pursue it again, he would do it himself, with his own eyes, so that the assessment of whether something was real would be his own. He looked at her and said that he was glad he had come himself this time. She looked back at him and said nothing, which was sometimes the clearest answer. The excavation began the following morning. Howard Lennox and his 2 workers went into the cellar at first light. They moved carefully, taking measurements first, photographing the wall, making notes. The sound that came up from the cellar door that day was not the sound of digging, but the sound of thinking, quiet voices, occasional tapping, the scrape of tools placed and picked up and placed again. Margaret went about her work. She made breakfast for the guests. There were now 3 others in the inn, alongside the survey team, regular paying travelers who were not aware of what was happening in the cellar, and who did not ask. She cleaned rooms, repaired a loose gutter bracket at the back of the building, started a pot of soup for the midday meal. At noon, Howard came up from the cellar. He had mortar dust on his coat and a look on his face that Margaret had not seen from him before. He asked for Edmund. She called Edmund in from the garden, where he had been standing near the east wall again, looking at the foundation. Howard showed them both his notebook. He had found, he said, the original entrance point. It was not where either of them had assumed, not the bricked-up section of wall she had noticed, but a section of the floor itself, beneath a large flat stone that had been set directly over the vault's original trapdoor. The trapdoor was not visible until you removed the flat stone above it, and the stone had been laid with such care that it was indistinguishable from the rest of the floor, unless you knew what to look for. Margaret's father had known what to look for. That was why his map had marked the entrance in the floor. Edmund asked whether they could open it safely. Howard said they could, with care. He said he would need another day to prepare the surrounding structure before they attempted it, to make sure nothing above would shift. Edmund looked at Margaret. He asked whether she was ready. She said she had been ready for weeks. She was simply waiting for the right moment. Howard went back down to prepare. Margaret went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and thought about her father, who had known about the entrance in the floor, and had chosen, every single day of his working life, to cook and clean and run his inn directly above it, without saying a word to anyone. She thought he had been a braver man than she had fully understood when he was alive. She turned up the heat under the soup, wiped her hands on her apron, and waited for tomorrow. The night before Howard Lennox was due to attempt the entrance, a man arrived at the Crescent Moon Inn who had not been invited. Margaret heard him first, not his voice but his horse, which came into the yard at 8:08, and stood waiting in a way that suggested it had been ridden hard. She was at the back window when she heard the hoofbeats, and she looked out to see a horse she did not recognize, breathing heavily, tied to the post near the stable. A figure was already at the front door. She went to open it. The man on the step was perhaps 45, with a heavy build and a suit that was expensive, but worn in the way that expensive things are worn by people who have had them a long time and need others to believe they are still valuable. He had a wide, flat face and eyes that moved too quickly, the way eyes move when they are looking for information rather than simply seeing. He gave his name as Corwin. He said it the way people say only a last name, as though a first name would make it too approachable. He said he was a county magistrate. He said he had heard about the excavation work at the inn and had come to discuss the legal implications. Margaret looked at him steadily. She said the inn was closed for the evening. He said he understood, but that the matter was time-sensitive. She said it would wait until morning, when the proper offices were open, and suggested he try the village inn 2 miles west for a room. He said he really must insist. She said she did not run her house on the basis of what uninvited men insisted upon, and she wished him a good evening. She closed the door. She stood in the front hall for a moment, listening. She heard him stand on the step for a longer time than a person simply leaving would stand. Then she heard him walk to his horse. Then she heard him ride away. She found Edmund in the sitting room. She told him what had happened. She gave him the name. His expression, always measured, became more still, in a way she had come to recognize as his version of concern. He told her that there was a county magistrate named Corwin who had been making inquiries in the area for years about land adjacent to the Aldenmere estate, buying small parcels, contesting old boundary surveys, building a quiet position that appeared to be designed around a long-term land acquisition. Edmund had been aware of him. He had not expected him to move this quickly. She asked how Corwin would have known about the excavation. Edmund said that in a small county, information moved. The magistrate's office that had witnessed their agreement was exactly the kind of place where a man like Corwin had sources. She thought about that. Then she asked what Corwin actually wanted, what he could legally do to interfere. Edmund explained. There was an old provision in county law that concerned subterranean spaces lying beneath property boundaries. If a vault extended past the boundary of a private property, which theirs appeared to do, into the old Aldenmere boundary, then the status of its contents could technically be disputed under a legal technicality that classified such spaces as separate parcels. It was a provision that had rarely been used. It was also a provision that could be weaponized by someone who had enough time and money to pursue it through the courts. Margaret looked at him. She said that if someone tried to stop the excavation through legal means, how long would that take to resolve? Edmund said that a clever solicitor could stretch it to months, even years. She sat down. She thought for a moment. Then she said that they needed to get into the vault before anyone could file a motion to stop them. Not recklessly, not in a way that damaged anything, but quickly. She asked Howard Lennox, through Edmund, whether the preparation he was doing could be completed by early morning rather than midday. Howard was consulted. He came up from the cellar with mortar on his hands and looked at both of them. He said he could have it ready by dawn, if he worked through the night. He said he had a lantern and had done worse things in worse conditions. Edmund looked at Margaret. She nodded. Howard went back down. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen with a lamp and a cup of tea that went cold, and she listened to the quiet sounds rising from the cellar, the careful scrape of tools, the occasional low voice of Howard speaking to his workers, the soft shifting of stone being examined and prepared. She thought about her father, who had sat in this same kitchen on countless evenings and listened to the same quiet inn around him. At 3 a.m, Edmund appeared in the kitchen. He poured himself tea without asking, sat down across from her, and did not say anything. He simply sat there, in the quiet, which she found she preferred to any number of things he could have said. At 5, Howard came up the stairs. He had dark circles under his eyes and mortar dust in his hair, and he looked like a man who had solved a problem that had been resisting him. He said they were ready. The three of them went down together. The cellar was cold, as always, and smelled of old stone. Howard's lanterns had turned it golden and strange. Margaret had been in this cellar hundreds of times, but it felt different now. Smaller, somehow, because of what they knew was beneath it. Howard led them to the center of the east section of the floor, where he and his workers had cleared away a section of the flagstones. Beneath them, now visible for the first time in living memory, was a large iron ring, set into a flat, dark slab of stone. The entrance. Howard knelt beside it. He explained what he had done. The small supporting reinforcements he had placed around the edges, to ensure that removing the slab would not shift the floor above the vault's cavity. He had tested the structure twice. He was confident it was stable. He looked at Margaret. He asked, because it was her building and her father's map, whether she wanted to be the one to open it. She looked at the iron ring. She thought about her great-grandfather building these walls. She thought about her grandfather adding the upper floor. She thought about her father, who had stood in this cellar and known exactly what was here, and had written, "It is not mine to open." She thought, but it is mine now. She crouched down, reached forward, and closed her hand around the cold iron ring. It was stiff with age, but not seized. She pulled steadily, and there was a long, low groan of stone shifting in a seal that had not been broken in more than 100 years, and then the slab lifted, and beneath it, down a short flight of stone steps, was darkness. Howard shone his lantern into the opening. The air that came up was dry and cold, and unlike anything she had smelled before. Old, completely sealed, the breath of a space that had been holding itself for generations. It was not unpleasant. It was simply ancient. They went down one at a time. Margaret went second, after Howard. Edmund came last. The vault was exactly the size Howard had predicted. The ceiling was low but clearable. The walls were original stone, well laid, and the floor was dry. Along the walls and across the floor, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had somehow, miraculously, given the years, held against the slow pressure of time, were stacked crates and cases, and a long flat chest with iron fittings. Howard moved his lantern slowly around the space. Nobody spoke. Margaret stood in the center of the vault and turned slowly, taking it in. She was standing inside something her father had known about and chosen to protect for 30 years. She was standing in the answer to a question that the Aldenmere family had been asking for 60. She was standing in the reason that a man had arrived at her inn in the rain and drunk her tea and looked at her floor in a way that had told her, before she understood why, that something was about to change. Edmund came to stand beside her. He looked at the crates, the cases, the long flat chest. His face was composed, but his voice, when he spoke, was quieter than usual. He said that his grandfather had told him about this place when he was a boy. He had always believed it was a story. He had come here half expecting to confirm that it was. She looked at him. She asked what he felt, standing here now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he felt the weight of what it meant to be wrong about something for a long time and then, suddenly, to be right. She understood that feeling. She had been collecting it herself, in small amounts, over the past weeks. Howard crouched by one of the crates and carefully worked the edge of the oilcloth back. Beneath it, wooden slats. He eased one slat free and held the lantern close. Gold coin, dense and dark with age, stacked in the careful way that someone had taken time to stack them 100 years ago. Margaret looked at the coins. She thought about the debt in the tin box, and the agreement in the tin box, and the percentage that was hers by the terms she had insisted on writing down and having witnessed. She thought about Oliver's carriage disappearing down the road in the morning light, and the way she had stood on the porch and watched it go, and then gone inside and started a fire. She thought that her father would have been very, very pleased. Howard replaced the oilcloth carefully. He said they needed to proceed properly from here, catalog everything, bring in the appropriate legal witnesses, ensure the chain of documentation was correct. He said that what was in this vault was not something to be rushed, because the value of it depended as much on proper handling as on the contents themselves. Margaret agreed. She told Howard to proceed at whatever pace the work required, and to let her know what he needed. He said he needed coffee, and she told him she would have it ready in 20 minutes. They went back up the stairs. Edmund replaced the iron slab carefully. At the top, back in the ordinary stone cellar with its coal and its jars and its familiar cold, Margaret stood for a moment and breathed. The vault was real. Everything in it was real. And the inn above it, her father's inn, her great-grandfather's walls, her grandfather's upper floor, her own repaired shutters and fixed porch steps and new garden rows, was still standing. She went upstairs to make coffee. By the time the morning light was coming through the kitchen window in long pale strips, Howard Lennox had already set up a proper recording system in the cellar. He had a ledger, a measuring tape, and a careful hand, and he moved through the preliminary catalog with the kind of focused quiet that told Margaret he had done this before, and understood that accuracy in the early stages was the thing that everything else depended on. Edmund had sent a message the night before, through a messenger who had left before dawn on a fast horse, to his solicitor in the nearest city. He had also sent a second message, shorter, to his sister on the Aldenmere estate. When Margaret asked whether his sister knew the full situation, he said she now knew enough to expect significant news. Margaret made breakfast for the household. The 3 regular travelers who were staying at the inn came down one by one, ate their food, settled their bills, and left, without knowing that below the floor they had been walking on, something had shifted that would change the story of the county for years. She found that she did not mind not telling them. Some things were not everyone's business until they were ready to be. The person who made them everyone's business, as it turned out, was Corwin. He returned at 9:30 in the morning. This time he came with 2 men, not officials, but the kind of broad-shouldered men who accompany officials when they want to suggest authority without actually having it. He did not knock. He walked around the side of the inn to the garden, where he had apparently heard, from whoever had told him about the excavation in the first place, that the work was being done. Margaret saw him from the kitchen window. She dried her hands on a cloth, went to the back door, and opened it before he reached it. She asked him what he wanted. He said he was here in his capacity as a county magistrate to inspect a property survey being conducted without proper county notification. She told him the survey had been properly authorized and witnessed at the county magistrate's office, and that she had a signed copy of the authorization available for his inspection. He said there were additional requirements that had not been met, concerning subterranean work at properties along old boundary lines. She said she was unaware of any additional requirements, and that if such requirements existed, he was welcome to present them in writing through the proper legal channels. He said this was urgent and required immediate attention. She said she understood that he felt it was urgent, and that she still required anything he wished to claim in writing through the proper channels, and that until she received something in writing, she would be grateful if he stepped back off her property. He looked at her. She looked at him. One of his broad-shouldered companions took a half-step forward, and then, as though he had thought better of it, took it back. Corwin said, quietly, that she was making this more difficult than it needed to be. She said she was simply making it accurate. He left. But not far. When Margaret went upstairs to check the front room window, she could see his horse tied to a post at the edge of the road, and the 3 men sitting on a fence near it, watching the inn. She came back downstairs and told Edmund. Edmund's expression did exactly what she had come to expect it to do. It became very still, which in him was the equivalent of another person raising their voice. He said that Corwin would, at some point today, find a way to file a motion with the county court that would, in theory, require them to cease work until the matter of the subterranean boundary was resolved. She asked how long they had. He said, realistically, a few hours before any legal filing could physically reach them. The county court was 2 hours away by road. Corwin would need to ride there himself, or send someone. She looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. She looked at Edmund. She told him they should go back downstairs. They went back to the cellar. Howard was deep in the catalog work and looked up with the politely irritated expression of a specialist who does not appreciate interruptions. Edmund explained the situation in 3 sentences. Howard looked at his notes and then at the vault entrance. He said that the most important items, from a legal and documentation standpoint, were the charters. The gold and the jewelry were valuable, but their recovery could wait and could survive a legal delay. The charters, however, needed to be physically seen and formally verified before any legal motion could argue about their existence, because you could not dispute the presence of something that had already been witnessed and recorded by multiple parties. He said they should go in and go directly to the charters. Margaret asked how they would know which case held them. Howard said her father's map was the answer. He pointed to a spot on the map where a small mark had been made, almost invisible, at one corner of the vault. He said her father had labeled it faintly, in pencil, with a letter. He had noticed it when he first studied the map, but had taken it for an ink stain. Margaret looked at the mark. The letter was a P, her father's initial. Her father had been inside the vault. He had been in there at some point, and he had marked where something specific was kept, and then he had sealed it back up and written nothing more than a line in a private ledger and kept the secret for the rest of his life. She felt, in that moment, the full weight of what her father had been carrying. They went down. Howard moved directly to the far left corner of the vault, where a flat leather case sat beneath a layer of oilcloth. He lifted the cloth. The case was old, its leather dark and cracked, but the brass fittings on it were intact. He tried the latches carefully. They were stiff but not locked. They opened with a sound like a breath held too long, and finally released. Inside, on a bed of old fabric that had gone stiff but had not rotted, were folded documents. Each one was folded with the particular precision of official papers, even and deliberate, sealed with wax that had dried to a dull red. Some of the seals were intact, some had cracked along the fold lines, but the paper itself, protected by the sealed case and the dry air of the vault, was not destroyed. It was brown with age and fragile at the edges, but it was readable. Howard lifted the top document with careful hands and unfolded it one layer at a time. His face as he read it was the face of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it exactly where he was told it would be. He read the first paragraph aloud, quietly, in a tone that was more for himself than for either of them. Then he looked up and said, simply, that this was what they were looking for. Edmund crossed the vault in 3 steps and looked at the document over Howard's shoulder. He was still for a long time. Then he reached out, not quite touching the paper, and said the date at the top of the charter, slowly, as though he was confirming it to himself. Margaret stood at the edge of the space and watched them both. She was thinking about her father, who had gone down into this vault alone, and read these same documents, and then carefully resealed everything, and gone back upstairs, and made dinner, and said nothing. She was thinking about what kind of man would do that. Not a coward. She had never thought her father cowardly. A careful man. A man who understood that some things were not his to decide. A man who had kept something important safe until the right moment came. She thought the right moment had come. Howard looked up from the document and addressed both of them. He said they needed a witness. Not a legal solicitor. Not yet. That was hours away. But someone who could confirm, here and now, that these documents had been found, in this vault, on this day, by these people. Someone whose word was unimpeachable. Edmund said he knew someone. He went back upstairs. He came down 10 minutes later with the village minister, a man named Arthur Greaves who had known Margaret's father, and who had been a respected figure in Ashvale for 30 years. Edmund had found him in the garden next door, where he had apparently been visiting Dorothy Cole. Arthur Greaves came down the cellar stairs slowly, looked around the vault, and spent a long time looking at the documents before he said anything. Then he said that Arthur Holloway had been a better man than most people had understood, and that he was not at all surprised. He signed Howard's catalog as a witness. He gave his full name and his position. He dated it clearly. 20 minutes later, Edmund's solicitor arrived. He had made faster time than expected, and went through the documents with professional care. He looked at the charters. He looked at the county map Edmund had been working with, and he looked at the catalog Howard had produced. Then he sat at the kitchen table upstairs and began writing in the precise and careful language of legal documentation. Corwin came back to the property at just past 1 in the afternoon. This time he had a younger man with him, who introduced himself as a court clerk. He had a motion, he said. He read it aloud. It cited the subterranean boundary provision and called for an immediate halt to any excavation or removal of materials until the county court could assess the matter. Edmund's solicitor, who was sitting at the kitchen table with his pen still in his hand, asked to see the motion. He read it. Then he told Corwin, in the measured tone of a man who has never once raised his voice in a professional setting, that the motion was moot. The items in dispute had already been witnessed, catalogued, and documented by 3 parties, including a representative of the county church. The charters had been physically verified as Aldenmere property. A motion to halt the extraction of property that had already been legally identified and witnessed was not a motion that would survive its first hearing. He said it politely. He said it firmly. He said it in a way that left no opening for argument, that did not require someone to be wrong in a very visible way. Corwin stood in the kitchen of the Crescent Moon Inn and looked at Margaret, who was standing near the stove with a clean apron and calm eyes. She looked back at him, without expression. She had nothing to say to him that would help him. And she had learned, in the past weeks, that silence in the right moment was one of the most powerful things a person had. He left. The clerk went with him. Howard came up from the cellar for coffee. He drank it standing up, which was how he drank everything, and he told Margaret that the rest of the catalog work would take another 3 to 4 days, and that the physical removal of the items would require 1 more day after that. He said that her father's vault was in remarkable condition, all things considered, and that whoever had built it had done excellent work. She said that whoever had built it had apparently known what they were doing. He said, clearly, yes. That evening, the solicitor went back to the city with copies of the key documents. Edmund stayed at the inn. Dorothy Cole, who had arrived for her regular Friday work and had taken in the whole situation with characteristic composure, made a large pot of soup and set it on the table and told everyone to sit down. They sat. Edmund, Howard, Arthur Greaves the minister, and Margaret. They ate the soup. Dorothy sat with them because Margaret asked her to, and she poured the tea without ceremony and asked Howard if he wanted more bread, which he did. It was a quiet table, not uncomfortably quiet. The quiet of people who have been through something together and do not need to explain it to each other. Outside, the wind was still and the road was empty. Corwin's horse was nowhere in sight. The excavation equipment was secured in the cellar. The vault was sealed again for the night, and the documents were on their way to the city. She thought about all the evenings her father had sat in this kitchen and fed the people who came to the inn, and asked nothing from them beyond payment and reasonable behavior. She thought about what he had said to her, years ago, when she was very young, and had asked him why he worked so hard for a place that hardly made any money. He had said, because it is real, because it stands, because when people come here tired and cold, and they find it warm, and the food is ready, it matters to them, and that is a thing worth doing. She had been 8 years old, and had not fully understood it. She understood it now. She picked up her spoon and ate her soup. The legal process that followed was not quick, but it was decisive. Edmund's solicitor filed the primary documentation with the county court within 4 days of the vault being opened. The charter documents were examined by 2 independent specialists in historical legal papers, both of whom confirmed their authenticity without hesitation. The seals, the paper, the formal language, and the dates all matched what the Aldenmere estate records had described. The land charters were genuine. They had been missing from the official record for 63 years. They were now found. What this meant, in practical terms, was that the legal claim the Aldenmere estate had been unable to pursue for over 6 decades suddenly had the evidence it needed to proceed. The land in question, a substantial tract on the eastern side of the county that had been held in disputed status for years and exploited by various interests who had relied on the ambiguity of its ownership, now had a clear and documented owner. Corwin's motion was dismissed within a week of being filed. The judge who heard it spent 20 minutes with the documentation and another 10 minutes with the solicitor's argument, and then said, in the way that judges speak when they are doing something routine, that the motion lacked merit and was denied. Corwin was in the courtroom when the decision was read. Margaret was not, because she had not been asked to attend and had no desire to stand in a room and watch a man lose an argument. She heard about it from Edmund, who had been there, and from Dorothy, who heard it from someone in the village, and from Arthur Greaves, who read the brief summary in the county paper. The inventory of the vault took 4 days to complete. Margaret sat in on the process for an hour each morning, watching Howard work through the crates and cases with the careful hands and the careful notes. The gold coin was intact. The years and the dry air had preserved it cleanly. The jewelry, which Howard set in a separate catalog with its own numbering, was extraordinary, not just in value, but in craft. There were pieces of workmanship that Howard said he had not seen outside of museum collections. Margaret looked at them in the lamplight and thought that they were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been made by someone who cared about the making. The chest with the documents was handled last and separately, with Edmund present. Howard lifted each document out individually, unfolded it with cotton gloves and maximum care, and laid it on a clean cloth, while Edmund's solicitor noted the details. There were the land charters, 5 of them, covering different portions of the original Aldenmere territory. There were also deed records, old letters between the original Aldenmere family and county officials from the 1740s, and a handwritten inventory of the vault's contents made by the person who had sealed it. This last document was, Howard said, the most useful of all from an authentication standpoint. It was a list, in the original hand, of everything placed in the vault. Going through the actual contents against this list, they found that nothing was missing. Nothing had been removed. The vault had been sealed and left completely undisturbed from the day it was closed until the morning Margaret had pulled on the iron ring. She thought about that. She thought about the fact that her father had been in there. He must have been, to have marked the location of the charters on his map, and had left everything exactly as it was. He had looked, and he had noted, and he had sealed it back and walked away. That level of discipline, of restraint, of deciding that something was not yours to take, even when you could easily have taken it, was a thing she had not fully accounted for in her image of her father. She found she was proud of him, in a new and deeper way. On the last day of the formal inventory process, Edmund came to find her in the garden. She was in the vegetable beds, which she had been slowly clearing and turning over in the evenings when the inn work was done. She had found, buried under the overgrowth, that her father's soil was very good, dark and loamy, and full of the kind of earthworms that meant a bed that had been well maintained over many years. Edmund stood at the edge of the garden and watched her for a moment before she looked up. She straightened, pulled off her gardening gloves, and looked at him. He told her that the formal inventory was complete. Everything had been documented in the way that would satisfy the court. The physical removal would begin tomorrow, handled by a specialist firm he had arranged, who would transport everything to the Aldenmere estate under proper guard. He told her that the total value of the vault's contents, based on initial assessments, was substantial. He told her that her percentage, as agreed in the signed document, would amount to more than enough to settle the debt, to repair the inn to a standard that would serve it well for another generation, and to have a meaningful sum remaining. She looked at him. She said she was glad. He said that was an understatement. She said she preferred understatements. She asked if the specialist firm would be careful with the floor of the cellar when they took the items out. He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she could see him recalibrating something. He said yes, he would make sure of it. She said good. She had plans for the east cellar. She thought she would open it up properly, reinforce the walls, and use it as additional storage. The inn needed more storage. He looked at her. He asked whether she had thought about what she was going to do with the inn, now that the debt would be gone, and she had the means to make real decisions about it. She said she had thought about it constantly for weeks. She was going to keep it. She was going to restore it properly, the way it deserved to be restored. She was going to hire someone to help in the kitchen, someone good, and she was going to improve the stable so it could hold more horses, and she was going to replace the sign above the door so the name was legible from the road again. She had a list. He said, as though the thought had only just occurred to him, that she always had a list. She said a list was how a person turned thinking into doing, and that without lists, things remained ideas, and ideas without action were just expensive feelings. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that he agreed completely. She looked back at him. There was something in the conversation that was reaching a point she had not expected, and she was not entirely sure how to navigate it, which was unusual for her. She put her gardening gloves back on and turned to the soil. He said her name. She stopped. He said that he intended to come back to Ashvale, not for legal purposes, not for the estate. He said he had found the county more interesting than he had expected, and that he had certain business concerns in the region that would benefit from closer attention. She looked at the garden. She said that was entirely his own affair. He said he was mentioning it because he wanted her to know. She thought about that. She pulled a root from the soil that had been in the ground too long and set it aside. She thought about a man who had come through a storm and sat at her table and poured tea for both of them and looked at her floor like it was a question he needed to answer, and had turned out to be right about something that no one else had been right about for 60 years. She said he was welcome at the inn whenever he came through. The room rate was the same for everyone. He said he knew. She heard, without turning around, the slight shift in his voice that she had come to recognize as the thing he did instead of smiling, and she went back to work in her father's garden. That evening, after the solicitor had gone, and Howard had packed the last of his equipment, and the vault had been properly sealed for transport preparation, the inn was quieter than it had been in weeks. Margaret made a simple dinner for herself, and sat at the kitchen table alone. The lamp was on. The fire was warm. The tin box behind the flour jar had been moved to a drawer, because what was in it now was no longer survival money, but the beginning of something else. She thought about the morning Oliver had left. She thought about standing on the porch, watching his carriage disappear. She thought about the letter from the moneylender, and the empty stable, and the crooked shutter, and the long list of things that needed fixing. She thought about how different everything looked from here, on this side of all of it. She opened her notebook and began a new list. Not a list of debts or repairs. A planning list. What the kitchen needed. What the stable could produce by summer if she started it right. What the rooms could look like with proper attention. Who she might hire, and what she needed them to be good at. She wrote until the lamp needed oil, then topped it up and kept writing. The inn was quiet around her. The thick old walls held in the warmth. Somewhere below her, in the cellar, the vault entrance was sealed, and waiting for the removal team tomorrow. And above her, the rooms that her great-grandfather had built, and her grandfather had expanded, and her father had run for 31 years, and that she had spent the last several weeks fighting for with everything she had, were dark and quiet, and standing exactly as they had always stood. She finished the list. She closed the notebook. She sat for a moment in the warm quiet of the kitchen and let herself feel, completely and without qualification, what it felt like to have won. It felt like the first day of something. She put the notebook away, washed her cup, checked the door locks, and went to bed. She slept well, which was something she had not done in a long time. The removal team that Edmund sent were 6 men, and they worked with the efficiency of people who had handled valuable and fragile things before. They arrived early and moved quietly, and did not require Margaret to oversee them every minute, which she appreciated. She checked in periodically, observed their care with the vault contents, and went back to her own work, feeling that her instructions had been understood. They reinforced the floor opening before and after each removal. They transported everything in sealed containers. By the end of the second day, the vault was empty, and the floor of the cellar was intact. Margaret went down alone that evening, after the team had left and the inn was quiet. She walked to the east corner, and stood at the stone slab that covered the entrance. She looked at the iron ring, the ring that she had pulled with her own hands, and that had opened something that had been sealed for more than a century. She stood there for a while, thinking. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not the legal process, not the excavation, but the weeks before all of that. The mornings she had lit a fire and made bread when there was almost nothing left in the house. The evenings she had sat at the kitchen table with a list and a lamp and made herself see her situation clearly instead of looking away from it. The day she had put up a small sign at the village shop and been afraid no one would come. The night Edmund had knocked on the unlocked door in the rain and she had shown him a room and not thought twice about it. She thought about Oliver's carriage on the road. She thought about how afraid she had been that morning, though she had not said so. How afraid, and how alone, and how certain that the worst was still ahead. She thought about all the moments when she could have given up, when she could have told the moneylender to take the building, when she could have left Ashvale and gone somewhere else and started over as a different kind of person, with a different kind of story. She would not pretend she had not. On the very hardest mornings, she had sat at the kitchen table and run the calculation, and asked herself whether the fight was worth the cost. Every time, she had decided it was. She looked at the iron ring in the stone and thought, it turned out she had been right. She went back upstairs. The next morning, she hired a builder from the village to come and look at the east cellar. His name was Henry Cole, and he was Dorothy's son, and he had the same directness as his mother, and the same good practical eyes. He went through the cellar, looked at the structure, measured the space, and told her what the work would cost to open the vault properly and use it as storage. The number was reasonable. She told him to start the following week. She also wrote a letter to Oliver's solicitor, formally. The letter was brief and did not contain anything unnecessary. It stated that she was managing the property independently, that the financial circumstances of the inn had changed substantially, and that she would be pursuing the legal separation that she had already filed for, and expected it to proceed without complication. She sent it that afternoon with a rider. Oliver's solicitor wrote back within the week. The response was formal and unsurprising, and confirmed what she had expected. Oliver had made no legal claim on the inn. Whether because he knew he had no grounds, or because he had simply moved on to whatever came next for him, she could not say, and she did not particularly care. The separation was agreed. Within the month, the paperwork came through the proper channels and was witnessed and finalized, and Margaret Holloway became, legally as well as practically, the sole owner of the Crescent Moon Inn. She put the finalized documents in a folder in the top drawer of her father's desk and went to check on the kitchen. The inn had changed in practical ways since the money from the vault's contents came through. She had paid the moneylender in full, in person, with the exact amount and not a shilling more. She had paid Dorothy's back wages, with a small additional amount that Dorothy tried to refuse, and Margaret insisted on. She had paid the coal supplier his outstanding bill, and set up a regular order for the coming season. She had bought new bed linens for all 7 rooms, not extravagant ones, but good solid ones, that would last. She had had a proper carpenter in to fix the things she had not yet gotten to, and she had stood beside him for most of the work and watched how he did it, because she believed that watching an expert was one of the better ways to learn. The kitchen was the project she enjoyed most. She had reorganized it herself, moving the work table to a better position near the light, adding shelves for the dry goods, replacing 2 pots that had been struggling for years and should have been replaced long before. She had hired a woman named Ruth Aldgate to help in the kitchen 3 days a week, a sensible woman in her 40s, who was a better baker than Margaret, and had a calm efficiency with the midday meal that freed Margaret to handle the front of house on the busy days. The stable had been enlarged by Henry Cole's crew. It could now hold 6 horses properly, which meant that traveling parties who had previously passed the inn by because they needed more room for their animals now had a reason to stop. 3 such parties had come through in the first 2 weeks after the work was finished, and all 3 had paid well and spoken positively about the food. Margaret had also done something that she had not planned, but that turned out to be one of the best decisions she made in those months. She had spoken to the village school about hosting the children for an afternoon tour of the historical parts of the inn. Arthur Greaves had suggested it. The inn was, he pointed out, one of the oldest buildings in the area, and the discovery of the vault made it a place of genuine historical interest. She had thought about it and decided he was right. The children had come on a Tuesday afternoon, 12 of them between the ages of 7 and 11, with their teacher, and with a great deal of barely controlled energy. She had shown them the thick walls of the ground floor and explained how they were built. She had taken them to the cellar, not to the vault entrance, which was sealed, but to the general space, and explained how old buildings were constructed. She had made them ginger biscuits and tea, and they had sat in the front sitting room, and she had told them the story of the inn as she knew it, going back 4 generations to the first walls. They had asked excellent questions. One small girl, with very neat braids, had asked whether Margaret was scared when she found out that there was something hidden under her house. Margaret had thought about it honestly, and said yes, a little. But she had also been curious, and she had found that curiosity was stronger than fear, if you let it be. The teacher had looked at her with the expression of a person who might be writing that down later. After the children left, the inn had felt different in a way she could not quite name, lighter, somehow, as though it had been reminded of its purpose. It was a place for people. It had always been that, and it would continue to be that. The story beneath it was remarkable, but the story above it was the one that mattered day to day. Edmund came back, as he had said he would. He came on a Thursday in the early spring, arriving not in a grand way, but in the same practical carriage he had arrived in the first time, which told her that this was not an occasion he was dressing up. He came in, looked at the hall, noticed the new paint and the repaired staircase, and said that the place looked well. She thanked him and asked if he was staying for dinner. He said he was staying for several days, if she had a room available. She said room 4 was open. He said he was glad. He went upstairs. She went back to the kitchen and told Ruth to expect an extra person for dinner, and Ruth said nothing, but added more to the pot in the way that experienced kitchen people do, without making anything of it. That evening, after dinner, Edmund stayed at the table, while Ruth cleared, and Margaret poured tea. He told her that the legal resolution of the Aldenmere claim was proceeding well. His solicitor expected the main settlement to be finalized within 3 months. He told her that the charters had been received by the court with the kind of relief that institutions display when something long complicated becomes simple. He told her that his sister had been at the estate when the vault contents arrived, and had stood in the entrance hall and looked at everything laid out for documentation, and had not said anything for a long time. Margaret asked what his sister had said when she finally spoke. He said she had said that their grandfather would have been enormously pleased, and that she hoped the woman who found it had been properly thanked. Margaret looked at him. She asked whether he had passed the message on. He said he was doing so now. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said that she had not found it exactly. She had inherited it. There was a difference. He said he thought the two were, in her particular case, the same thing. She considered that. She thought about the ledger in the drawer, and the map folded into its spine, and the careful line her father had written, "It is not mine to open, but it is mine to keep." She thought that she had done both. She had kept it, first, for the weeks before she understood what she was keeping. And then she had opened it, not recklessly but carefully, with the right person beside her, and the right documentation in hand. She thought her father had understood something she had only recently learned herself. That keeping something is not about holding it closed forever. It is about holding it closed until the moment is right, and then opening it, with your eyes open, knowing exactly what you are doing. She poured more tea. Outside, the spring evening was long and light, and the road past the inn was visible from the window well into the dusk. She could see the sign above the front door from where she sat. The name of the inn, freshly painted, fully legible for the first time in years. The Crescent Moon, 4 generations of Holloways, her great-grandfather's walls, her grandfather's upper floor, her father's careful keeping, and her own stubborn refusal to let any of it go. She thought it was a good sign. She thought the inn was in good hands. She sat at the table with Edmund across from her, and Ruth moving in the kitchen, and the spring light outside the window, and she drank her tea, and felt, without drama and without excess, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Spring in Ashvale had a particular quality that Margaret had loved since she was a child, the way the valley seemed to exhale after the long cold months, the river running fast and bright with the snowmelt from the hills, the road turning from mud to firm earth over the course of a few warm days. She had always noticed it. This spring, she noticed it more than usual, because for the first time in a long time she was paying attention to things that were not emergencies. She was standing at the upstairs window in the early morning, looking at the garden below, when she heard Edmund's door open, and his steady footsteps on the stairs. He was, she had established in the 3 days he had now been staying, a man who rose with the light and came down without fuss, and helped himself to tea, and sat at the kitchen table with something to read while the house woke around him. She had adjusted to this without thinking about it, which was itself a thing she thought about briefly, and then set aside. She came downstairs. Ruth would not arrive until 8. Margaret put the kettle on and cut bread, and set out what was left of the previous evening's cold beef. Edmund looked up from his papers and said good morning, which he always did in the same clear, unhurried tone, and she responded in kind and sat at the table. They ate in the comfortable quiet that they had developed over weeks of odd meals at the same table. First, when he had been a guest she did not know, and then when he had been a partner in something large and uncertain, and now, in this current moment, which had a name she had not yet assigned to it, and was not hurrying toward. He told her, while she was refilling her cup, that he had received a letter from his sister that morning. The courier had arrived before Margaret was up. His sister's name was Catherine, and she had apparently decided, based on what Edmund had written to her, that it was time she came to Ashvale herself and saw the inn. Margaret asked when she was planning to come. Edmund said she had written next week, with a question mark. Margaret said she could have room 2, which was the second largest and had the best view of the garden. He looked at her. He said she was certain she did not mind. She said a guest was a guest, and the room would be ready. He said Catherine was not like most guests. She asked what that meant. He said that his sister had a great deal of energy and a great deal of curiosity, and that she was likely to have many questions, and that she tended to ask all of them. Margaret said that questions were fine. She had answers. And if she did not have answers, she said so, which was generally more useful than pretending. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his version of warmth. Not obvious, not declared, but present in the steadiness of the look and the slight ease in the set of his shoulders. He said he was inclined to agree. Catherine Voss arrived on a Wednesday, in a carriage that was somewhat grander than Edmund's but still practical, driven by a coachman who had the look of a person who had been doing the same job for many years and considered it perfectly good employment. She was Edmund's younger sister by 4 years, and she had his gray eyes and his posture, but none of his quietness. She came into the inn looking at everything with frank and cheerful interest, asked Margaret 4 questions in the first 5 minutes about the building's age and the vault and the garden and the sign above the door, and then said, unprompted, that she could see why Edmund had stayed. Margaret thanked her for coming and showed her to room 2. Catherine came downstairs an hour later, with her coat off and her sleeves pushed up in a way that suggested she had no intention of being treated as a guest who needed managing. She sat at the kitchen table while Margaret was preparing the midday meal and said, without preamble, that Edmund had told her the full story, and she wanted to know what it had been like. Not the legal parts. She had those from the solicitor. The actual experience of it. What it had been like to find the ledger and go down to the cellar and pull on the iron ring. Margaret looked at her. She decided that she liked Catherine Voss, who was a person who asked what she actually wanted to know, instead of circling around it. She told her. Not quickly, and not dramatically. She had never been a dramatic person, but honestly and in order. From the morning Oliver left to the morning the vault was opened, Catherine listened, without interrupting, which was, given her evident energy, a sign of real focus. When Margaret finished, Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the part she kept returning to was the ledger. The moment her father had written, "It is not mine to open, but it is mine to keep." She said she thought that was one of the most remarkable things a person could do, to know something, to protect it, and to trust that the right moment would come without forcing it. Margaret said she had thought about that too. She said she believed her father had understood something about timing that she was still learning. Catherine looked at her. She said that from what she had heard, Margaret was learning it very quickly. Ruth came in to help with the midday meal, and Catherine immediately offered to assist with something, and Ruth immediately put her to work peeling vegetables with the comfortable authority of a woman who wastes no useful hands, and the kitchen became lively, in a way that Margaret had not realized she had been missing until it was present. Edmund appeared in the doorway. He looked at the kitchen, his sister at the work table, Ruth directing operations, Margaret at the stove, and he stood there for a moment with an expression that Margaret caught only in profile, and that looked, for just an instant, like a man who is standing outside something warm and seeing it clearly for the first time. She did not say anything about it. She asked if he was hungry. He said he was. She said dinner would be ready in an hour. He sat down at the table. The afternoon that followed was the kind of afternoon that seems ordinary while it is happening and becomes memorable only later, when you realize that it was the day when something settled into a shape that would hold. Catherine and Edmund argued in the cheerful, practiced way of siblings who enjoy each other's company, without needing to perform for anyone. Ruth made her opinion known on the matter of whether the salt had been adequate at lunch, which it had not, and made adjustments. Margaret moved between the kitchen and the front rooms, checking that the other guests had what they needed, watching the spring light change on the garden. Late in the afternoon, she went to the vault. Not down inside it. Henry Cole's crew had finished the reinforcement work, and the trapdoor was sealed with a proper-fitting hatch now, set level with the floor. She went to the cellar, walked to the east corner, and stood above it. The hatch looked like exactly what it was, a well-built access point to a proper storage space that would hold the inn's overflow in the seasons ahead. Beneath it, the vault was empty. Everything had been removed and documented and transported. The dry air and the old stone and the careful structure that had held everything intact for more than a century were still there. But the contents were gone, properly and legally, and with full documentation, exactly as they should be. She stood above the hatch and thought about all the things that had been stored down there, not just the gold and the jewelry and the charters. The decision her father had made, and his father before him, not to disturb it. The years of the inn standing above a secret that was not the inn's to tell, but that the inn had kept anyway. The way a building can be trusted with something, in its quiet way, just by staying where it was placed and doing what it was built to do. She thought about trust. She thought about what it meant to trust a place, and what it meant for a place to deserve that trust. She went back upstairs. That evening, after the other guests had retired and Ruth had gone home, and Catherine had finally run out of questions for the day and gone to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes. before going up herself. Edmund had gone to the sitting room after dinner, and she could see the lamp still on under the door. She sat with her tea and looked at the kitchen around her. The repaired shelves, the new pots, the clean work table. The window above the sink where the first garden light came in on the mornings when she was up early enough. The drawer where the legal documents were, and where her father's ledger still was, because she had decided she would always keep it here. She thought about the year that had just passed, not in a sad way, and not in a triumphant way, but in the way you review something that has taught you things you did not know you needed to learn. She had learned that she could fix things, not just hinges and shutters and loose boards, though she had learned those too, but things of substance, that she could face a situation that looked entirely against her, and find, by staying steady and paying attention, the particular thing that shifted it. She had learned that asking for help was not the same as admitting defeat, and that the right person at the right time, a woman like Dorothy, a man like Howard, even Edmund, could be the difference between a problem and a solved problem. She had learned that the things that are worth having usually require you to stay when you feel like leaving. She had always suspected that was true. Now she knew it. The lamp in the sitting room was still on. After a moment she stood up, washed her cup, and went to the door. She knocked twice, which was the quiet knock of a person who is not sure whether they are interrupting. Edmund said to come in. She opened the door. He was sitting in the chair near the window with a book, the same chair he had been sitting in on the first night she brought him dinner, which felt like a very long time ago. He looked up. He set the book down. She leaned against the doorframe and asked whether he had plans to be in Asheville for much longer. He said that depended on certain things. She asked what things. He looked at her steadily. He said that he found he had developed a strong preference for the county, and for the inn specifically, and that if it was not an inconvenience, he thought he might make it a regular point of return. She said the room rate remained the same regardless of frequency. He said he expected nothing less. She told him she was glad the inn suited him. She told him that she had plans to add a reading room, once the budget allowed for it, and that room 4 would be available on his standard visits unless she was full, in which case room 3 was also quite good. He said she was the most practical person he had ever met. She said she took that as a compliment. He said it was meant as one. She said good night. He said good night. She closed the door and went upstairs to her own room, which was the room at the top of the stairs with the view of the road. She looked out the window before she got into bed. The road was empty and silver in the late evening light, and the sign above the door was just visible from this angle. The crescent moon painted on the old board, cleaned and repainted, holding its shape above the entrance to her great-grandfather's walls. She turned away from the window and got into bed. She thought, before she closed her eyes, that her father had been right about one thing above all the others. The inn was real, and it stood, and when people came to it, tired and cold, and found it warm, and the food was ready, it mattered to them. That was a thing worth doing. She slept. The county news that ran in the regional paper 4 months later gave the story 17 lines, and used the words, significant historical discovery, and documented archival recovery, which were the kinds of words that managed to be accurate without quite capturing what had actually happened. Margaret read it on a Tuesday morning over her tea, and then set it down on the kitchen table, and did not think about it again. What she thought about, that morning, was the bread she was making, and the new order of coal that needed to be arranged before the weather turned, and the fact that the gutter on the east side of the roof was going to need attention before winter. She had Henry Cole's name in her notebook for that. She also thought about the letter she had received from the County Historical Society, which had asked, politely and formally, whether they might speak to her about the possibility of the inn being given some form of official recognition as a site of historical interest. She had written back that she was open to the conversation and would arrange a time the following month. She thought about these things in the way she thought about most things now, steadily, one at a time, in the order they needed to be addressed. The inn had settled into a new version of itself over the spring and summer. It was still the Crescent Moon Inn. It was still 4 generations of Holloways in the walls and the floors and the long timber of the upper gallery. But it was also, now, something that people knew about. Travelers came who had heard the story, not just from the county paper, but from the word of mouth that moves faster and farther than print in a small county. Some came out of curiosity, which she was fine with. Some came because they wanted to stay somewhere that had a story, which she was also fine with. Most of them, once they arrived, came back because the food was good, and the rooms were clean, and the fire was always going when the evening was cold. She had not changed the prices unreasonably. That was a deliberate choice. She had been to inns that believed an interesting history justified an interesting markup on everything, and she had found them unpleasant. The Crescent Moon charged fairly for what it offered. What it offered was excellent. Ruth had taken on an extra 2 days a week in the kitchen, and Margaret had found that she could trust her with the midday service entirely, which freed Margaret to manage the front of house, and the books, and the 100 other things that an inn required. She had also hired a stable hand named Pip, who was 14, and extremely reliable, and who had learned the proper way to handle horses so quickly that Margaret suspected he had known it all along, and had simply been waiting for someone to notice. Dorothy still came on Fridays. That was not going to change. The legal resolution of the Aldenmere land claim had been finalized in the early summer, as Edmund's solicitor had predicted. The charters were accepted by the court as genuine. The original land ownership was confirmed, and the 63-year dispute was formally closed. Edmund had told Margaret about it in a letter that arrived on a morning when she was up early fixing a window latch in room 3, and she had read it standing in the hall with the screwdriver still in her hand, and then she had put the letter in her pocket and finished fixing the latch. She was glad about it. She was glad about it the way she was glad about everything that had been resolved, cleanly and completely, without lingering. The share she had received, under the terms she had insisted on documenting before anything was moved, was in the bank in the county town. A portion of it had gone into the inn. A portion she intended to leave untouched, because she had learned from the past year that having a reserve was the difference between a problem that you could solve and a problem that solved you. One morning in late summer, she had gone to the moneylender's office, not because she had business there, but because she wanted to see it and feel nothing about it. She had stood outside the door for a moment, looking at the painted sign above it. She had thought about the man who had come to her door 6 months after her father died, and read her a list of what she owed. She had thought about standing in her kitchen afterward and making a list of her own. She had felt nothing about it, except a mild sense of interest, the way you feel about a place that used to be important and is no longer. She had walked home. Corwin had resigned his position as county magistrate in the weeks following the dismissal of his legal motion. No formal complaint had been filed against him. Edmund's solicitor had advised against it, noting that the outcome they had achieved was complete, and that pursuing a secondary action against a now irrelevant man would cost time without adding anything of substance. Margaret had agreed. She had no particular interest in Corwin, beyond ensuring he could not interfere with her again, and his resignation and his departure from the county had achieved that without her needing to do anything. She thought occasionally about what it means when people who try to take things from others eventually find that they have run out of room to move. She thought it was one of the more reliable patterns in human behavior. Greed that is organized only around other people's weaknesses tends to run into trouble when those people stop being weak. Oliver had not contacted her again after the solicitor's letter. The separation was finalized. She did not know where he had gone and had not asked. She thought of him occasionally, not with bitterness and not with warmth, but in the way you think about a part of your life that is over and that you have processed completely. He had left at the hardest moment. That was a fact. It had turned out to be, in some ways she had not expected, a gift. She was aware of that. She did not dwell on it. What she dwelt on, as autumn came back to the valley, and the road outside the inn turned copper with leaves, and the smell of wood smoke returned to the mornings, was what came next. She had a list, as always. The list was full of good things, improvements, expansions, changes that were choices rather than necessities. She was choosing from a position of strength, which was something she intended never to take for granted, because she knew what the other position felt like, and she had not forgotten it. The reading room was underway. Henry Cole's crew had been in for 2 weeks, expanding the small room off the main hall that had been used for storage since her grandfather's time. She was turning it into a room with bookshelves and a good fire and 2 deep chairs and a lamp for each chair. The kind of room where a person could sit for an hour and feel the particular rest that comes from being somewhere warm and quiet with nothing required of them. She had already begun collecting books for the shelves. Not random books, but the kinds that people actually wanted to read on a winter evening, which she had researched with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything. Edmund had sent a box of books from the Aldenmere Estate Library, with a note that said only, "I thought some of these might suit the room." The books were good ones. Several of them were old and well read, with the soft pages and bent spines of things that had been handled with care over many years. She put them on the shelves with the others, and did not make a point of separating them. He came back in the autumn. He came on a Friday, which meant that Dorothy was there, and Dorothy had at this point entirely reconciled herself to Edmund's presence at the inn, with the particular generosity of a woman who has decided that someone is all right and intends to act accordingly. She gave him tea when he came in, and asked after his sister with genuine interest, and he answered Dorothy's questions with what Margaret thought was more patience than he showed most people, which said something she thought well of. Catherine had also visited again, for a weekend in the summer, that had involved a great many walks, and a great many questions about the village, and a long conversation with Arthur Greaves about the history of the county that had lasted so long that Dorothy had eventually sent Pip in to remind the minister that his dinner was waiting. The inn had become, Margaret realized, a place where people genuinely wanted to be. Not because of the vault, though that had brought some people to it. Because of what it was, which was what it had always been under all the difficulty. A place that was well kept and warm, and where the food was honest, and the people who ran it paid attention. She thought her father had built something worth building. She thought she intended to keep building it. On the Friday evening of Edmund's autumn visit, after Dorothy had gone home and Pip had settled the horses and Ruth had left and the inn guests had retired, Margaret and Edmund sat in the front sitting room with the reading room door open and the fire going in both rooms, and Margaret could see the first books on the new shelves from where she sat. They drank tea and did not say very much, which was a thing she had come to appreciate about being in his company, that the silence between them was never uncomfortable, because it was never empty. He asked her, after a while, what she was planning for the winter. She told him. The menu would shift for the season. Heartier meals, more winter vegetables from the cellar she had properly stocked. She was thinking of offering a special rate for longer stays during the cold months, for travelers who were waiting out difficult weather, or wanted a base from which to conduct business in the county. She had corresponded with 2 small trading companies that moved goods through the region, and thought she could develop a relationship there. He listened to all of this. Then he said, in the tone he used for things he had been thinking about for a while, that he had a proposal he had been meaning to put to her. She said she was listening. He said that the Aldenmere estate had occasion, several times a year, to accommodate guests of the family in the county, associates, business connections, people whose visits were important, but who were not best served by the formality of the estate itself. He said he had been thinking that the Crescent Moon Inn, with its reputation now established and its quality evident, might be a natural choice for such guests. He said it would not be a large arrangement, and he would want to propose terms that worked for both of them, but that if she was interested, he thought it could be of benefit to each of them. She looked at him. She thought about it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because she took every proposal seriously before she answered. She said she would be interested in hearing the terms. He said he would have his solicitor prepare a draft. She said she would have her own eye on any document before she signed it, which he already knew. He said he would be disappointed if she did anything differently. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she did not often do in business conversations. She let herself smile, fully and without holding any of it back. He looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived near it. Outside, the autumn evening was coming in, fast across the valley, the sky going deep blue above the dark line of hills. The road past the inn was quiet. The lamp above the front door was lit, the way it always was after dark, so that people on the road could see the inn and know it was there. She had hung that lamp herself, on the evening she had decided that doing something was always better than waiting. She thought about the journey from that evening to this one. She thought about her great-grandfather's walls, and her grandfather's floor, and her father's careful keeping, and her own particular way of fighting for something she loved. She thought about a ledger in a drawer, and a map folded into its spine, and an iron ring in a stone floor. She thought about the morning she had pulled that ring, and the sound the stone had made, and the old dry air that had come up from the vault, like a held breath finally released. She thought it had all been worth it. Every single difficult part of it. She reached over and added wood to the fire. The flames rose, and the room was warm, And the inn held in the warmth, the way it always had. 4 generations of Holloways in the walls, holding the warmth against everything the world sent against it. She settled back into her chair and picked up her tea. The Crescent Moon Inn was open. The light above the door was on. And Margaret Holloway was exactly where she had decided she would stay.